All right. Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the excuse me, to the Beck community for letting me talk to you today, and hopefully pick your brain on a question that I'm currently been thinking a lot about, and that's the sensory detection of infectious disease. Before I get there, though, let's see if this is working. I do want to just introduce myself a little bit and mention a bit about what we do in my lab at Michigan. That is the ESP lab, or Evolutionary Social Psychology lab, where we focus on a very wide range of topics. A lot of these, oh, by the way, happy Darwin Day. It's Darwin Day today, so I figured this would be a nice place to give a shout out. Well, a lot of the work we do is on threat management, and this is, again, it's quite diverse, I would say, in terms of the topics that we study. Lots of different kinds of proximate ecological threats. We do, much of the work we do these days is on infectious disease, but we've done a wide variety of things. We do a bit on what we might call types of coping through life history investment, physiological immune functioning. And because a lot of what we do is on threats, we also focus on the flip side of that, and that is interventions against some of these psychological processes, anyway, that come online when people are threatened through various kinds of safety actions. So you'll see a little bit about this today in the context of infectious disease. We look at things like vaccination, hand washing, and so on, and then simulations as well. And then we just kind of go crazy on other kinds of things as well. So we do work on sensory motor processing. You'll see some of this today. A lot of what we do is on the sense of touch. We've done work on vicarious experience, how we get inside the heads of other people. And before coming to Michigan, I was in a marketing department, and so I still do some work on consumer behavior. For instance, our most recent project had to do with something we're calling the upgrade effect, where you might have experienced this. If a company releases an upgraded product and you are an owner of an existing product and you want that upgrade, you might unconsciously start to neglect or treat carelessly the product that you have as a way of justifying getting that new thing, right? So we see this with a lot of different kinds of products. Anyway, so those are some of the kinds of things that we do. In the work that I'll be talking to you about today, I do want to mention some of the people from the lab who have been a big part of some of this. So Iris and Nick are graduate students in the lab, and Oliver is a postdoc in the lab. So let's talk about infectious disease. Well, let's see if we need to talk about infectious disease. So according to the US Surgeon General in 1969, sort of closed the book on this infectious disease thing. We had basically solved this problem. If you've been alive since then, you might have noticed that there are quite a lot of infectious diseases still out there in the world, still causing certain kinds of problems, to the degree that some researchers have offered up quotes like this: yes, this war on infectious disease has been won, but it's by the other side. Right? Hopefully this is not quite the case. A lot of what I'll tell you about today has to do with how we manage this threat of infectious disease by understanding whether it actually exists in our environments. Infectious disease is still, historically, has been one of the, I would say, probably one of the greatest selection pressures on human evolution, but today it's still a big deal. So here's a map of pathogen richness. This has to do with the different types of pathogens that you might encounter in different parts of the world. And as recently as 2008, about 16% of all deaths in the world were still due to infectious disease. So it's still a pretty powerful danger and perhaps selection pressure on people. So the questions that I'll be talking to you about today have to do with this question of how we detect disease, right? That is, if this issue of infection is such a big deal, how do we understand whether or not there are true dangers around us, in our environments? So as part of this, I want to give a very, very brief history lesson about how people understand whether or not infectious diseases or pathogens exist in their environments. So this has been a question, obviously, throughout human history. There's been a lot of different kinds of ways of trying to understand this question. So early concepts of disease had to do with everything from, this is Pandora's box, so this idea of spirits that infected the human body, to different types of humoral imbalances that you could see in people's physical appearance, to miasma theory, which was popular during plague times and led to sort of crazy costumes like this that this is a doctor that doctors would wear in order to prevent bad air from getting into their system. Things like spontaneous generation of disease, and something that predated germ theory, which was relatively similar to it, but not focused on biological agents, this idea of contagion of spores. So spores being this contagious sort of chemical property. Today we have germ theory, which is sort of the, I would suppose, the leading theory behind pathogen transmission. So in case this is just a way of understanding where we'll be going with a lot of the work I'll be talking to you about today, you basically have this agent, this reservoir of germs. They get transmitted somehow, a variety of ways, into a host. Okay. So we've got germ theory, right? It is a relatively well understood or commonly accepted idea of thinking about disease. But it is probably not the way in which the average person goes about their day in terms of thinking about disease, right? Typically what most of us do is think conceptually about disease. So we might, for instance, get media reports about flu season, right? Telling us that, okay, it's a bad time of year, go get your flu shot. Right? So they're just informational. Things like stereotypes about certain groups that we have, that we associate certain kinds of people with germs and not other kinds of people. We can also get just direct communication about disease from other people. And I think this is a lot of how people tend to understand the possibility of a threat of pathogens existing in their environment. That being said, this is not what I'll mostly be talking about today. Instead, I'll be talking about sensory information that people use. So the experiential information that is certainly more primary than a lot of this conceptual information and maybe more useful than some of this conceptual information to pick up on these kind of dangers that people face. So the goals that I have for this talk is going to be, it's not going to be just a straightforward presentation of research and data. What I'm intending to do here is try to understand the big picture around sensory information and how people use sensory information to understand these disease threats. So I'm going to be telling you about what the literature says. So what are picking up on different points in the literature that connect to different sensory processes to understand whether or not people are able to identify pathogenic threats, and then what do they do about those kind of things. And then I'll wrap up this kind of review with a bunch of questions that I think that this raises for the various fields that are interested in this kind of stuff. But because I'm touching on a lot of different literatures when I go over this, there's going to be a lot that I am not familiar with. And so if you, especially in, for instance, people who are coming from other fields, like I'm a psychologist, so thinking about anthropological evidence, for instance, if you know things that connect to these topics, I would love to learn more about those. So let me know. If it's going to be something quick, then we can do it in the middle of the talk. If it's going to be more extensive, then maybe we'll do it in the discussion. Okay, so I'll be talking to you about direct and downstream effects and also non-human research and human research. What do we mean by direct and downstream? So this is going to be a fuzzy distinction, but essentially the idea is that people can detect the possibility of pathogenic threats in their environment either directly, that is, there is some sort of indicator, sensory indicator that there is a pathogen that exists. We can also see evidence of people's reactions to the possibility of these dangers through downstream processes, right? So you pick up on some kind of sensory information, and this changes your behavior in some sort of way. It changes your decision making, right? So if you see some kind of cue to disease here, it influences your choice of, let's say, what you're going to eat later on. Or it influences your behavior in terms of avoidance of a situation, those kinds of things. And so I'll make that distinction between this direct and this downstream. All right. Now, theoretically, one of the frameworks that I'm most familiar with, that a lot of this is being generated from, but it's certainly not the only framework that you could think about disease detection from, has to do with this distinction between what's known as the physiological versus the behavioral immune system. Right? And the behavioral immune system is this, it's an analogy to some degree, but it's this idea that we have a set of mental mechanisms, cognitions, affect, behavior, that help us to not just deal with the germs that exist inside ourselves right now, but to avoid or manage situations where we could become exposed to disease. Right? And this is a rapidly growing area of research. It absolutely intersects with other fields who are doing work not necessarily using the term behavioral immune system. In fact, some people here, including Dan, have pointed out that there's a lot of overlap between these ideas and other fields like psychoneuroimmunology. Right? So, but essentially, this behavioral immune system idea is focused on psychological ways we can manage the threat of disease. This literature focuses on a number of mechanisms, things like, in terms of cognitive mechanisms, how we associate people, groups, situations with disease, cognitive mechanisms associated with attention, like directing attention towards potential threats, rumination, and so on. And then there's affective mechanisms that people respond to, right? Disgust being one of the most talked about pathogens, disgust in particular, but also other kinds of anxieties like worries and fears around exposure. So you'll see some of this pop out in the different kinds of findings that I'll tell you about coming up. And lastly, in terms of just setting up the whole perspective here, there are a couple of important biases to point out. One of these is the sort of counters the notion that we should be accurate in terms of finding pathogenic threats in our environment. Right? It'd be great if that was the case, but there's good reason to expect that that's not going to be the case. So from this kind of error management perspective, where it's difficult to tell, if not impossible to see things like microorganisms, that we should essentially overgeneralize the threats that we see out there in the world, right? Because the cost of false alarming, saying that we see a threat, are often lower than the cost of not detecting those threats. So we should expect that people are going to see a lot of threat out there. At the same time, though, we should also expect that people are not always on when it comes to disease detection. That is, the cost of doing so might actually be high if we're constantly trying to pay attention to all of the pathogenic possibilities in our environment. And so there's this idea of what's called functional flexibility, which is the idea that we're going to be sensitive to cues, right? And those cues can come from the environment we exist in, they can come from a specific situation, or they could be reflective of different kinds of individual differences in people. So these, I think, are going to color a lot of the kinds of actual findings I'll tell you about. Okay, everybody on the same page here so far? Questions? Okay, so this is all about the senses. So what are we talking about with the senses? There are a lot of senses in the human body that have been discussed. Too many for me to talk about today. So I'm going to concentrate on what we consider to be maybe the layperson's type of senses. That is the big five senses. So we'll talk about sight, we'll talk about smell, we'll talk about touch, hearing, and taste, and how information that comes from those kinds of senses can be, or potentially can be, used to understand the threats that exist out there. Okay, now in order to jump into this sort of broad review, I thought it might be useful to offer up some questions that you could be thinking about during this, and again, that might lead discussion later on. Things like, well, is it the case that we should actually expect to see any variation at all in pathogen detection across or between the senses? That is, should we use some kinds of senses more than we use other kinds of senses to pick up on these threats? And if so, are there specific kinds of functional predictions we can make? Some of these will start to hopefully fall out from the review, but I'm sure you can think of others. There's a lot of these other kinds of questions, like should the ability to, or should the use of these sensory mechanisms vary across species, human cultures, individuals, across specific types of disease, depending upon the kinds of bodily changes those diseases can afford. Right? So a lot of different kinds of questions here. One that I'll just mention first is just how does the average person understand the use of sensory information to detect disease? That is, how do people think about this? So in order to just start out this talk, what I did is actually collected some data on this question. Just asked a bunch of people what they think in terms of using sensory information to detect disease. So here's how we did this. We've got data from 300 US participants who were imagined a scenario. So we did concentrate on a specific disease. This was a bad flu outbreak. Very, very apropos to what's going on these days. And so imagine there's a bad flu outbreak going on, and you are now locked in a room with somebody that you are working with. So you're on a team project or something, and you're working with this person. You don't know if they're sick. Maybe it would be helpful to know that. So what do you do in order to understand this? And so we asked people questions about their use of sensory information in terms of their perceived effectiveness of each sense and their likelihood of wanting to use sensory information from each sense independently. We asked people their reactions, emotional reactions, and then whether or not they think each sense is useful in terms of accurate identification of threats, right? So if I'm looking at somebody, can I tell? Can I tell better than how I tell if I'm smelling that person, and so on? And I'll just tell you really sort of the overview of these data. What we found was a lot of consistency in terms of the perceived effectiveness and likelihood of use of the different kinds of sensory information. So we had, for instance, people rank the senses in terms of which is going to be the most effective and most likely to be used. And here's what we found. And again, it was not difficult to generate this order. There's a lot of consistency. So basically people say, and this is true for effectiveness and likelihood of use, people think that sight-based information is the most effective. They think that then sound, then touch, then smell, and then taste-based information. So in this particular study, taste is kind of hopefully you recognize taste is kind of a throwaway. We're asking about other, like identification of this disease in other people. So maybe taste information isn't going to be your go-to sense. Although we could think about how people do this with other kinds of objects like food, where taste might play more of a role. So this is the people's perception of the most useful order of the senses. And I want to put this up here to just orient you or have you keep this in mind as we go through what the literature says on some of the data that I'll show you that we've actually collected around some of this kind of order. Also in terms of accuracy, here's what people thought would be their likelihood of accurately identifying disease in other people. All of these, maybe not quite so much taste, but all of these are above the midpoint of this scale, suggesting that people really do think that they can accurately tell if somebody is sick with an infectious disease using these different senses. Again, taste not so much. We got feedback, things like this. Yeah, so. Okay. So that's what people think. Now what do we know? Well, let's go through sense by sense. We'll start with sight. So I'm going to go in order of what people actually thought was the most effective. So with respect to sight information, and again, I'm going to break each of these down by what at least some touch points on what the non-human animal research says and what the human research says. So with sight, we do know that sight could potentially be very useful information because a lot of infections do cause physical changes in appearance to people. And so if people are sensitive to these, then especially in the context of disease, then these could be useful pieces of information. So in terms of direct effects, what we see in non-human animals, and I will mention there's a couple of areas of research where I'm personally not finding much. And this could be there is either a lack of research that's been done in this area, or it could just be that I'm not tuned in to this particular literature. And so if you know of work in an area, please definitely let me know in the discussion period. So there's not a lot of work on direct sensitivity. That is, directly identifying or seeking out visual information on disease in non-human animals. Now, for instance, primates do not seem to directly inspect for sexually transmitted infection cues in their partners. Right. Now, there could be downstream. We'll get to downstream. But for direct kinds of searching out of visual information that corresponds to disease, we don't see a lot of that, although there does seem to be some occasional points of evidence that suggest that there is some sensitivity to this information. So cattle, for instance, do orient to parasites who could be agents of infectious disease. Right? So they tend to like scan environments, and if there are more ticks in an environment, they won't go into those environments. But there's just not a lot that I've come across that suggests that non-human animals are really spending a lot of time directly finding visual cues to disease. How about humans? This is certainly much different in people, right? So a lot of evidence that humans are using cues that are visually apparent and certainly connected potentially to pathogenic threats. So a lot of times you'll see this played out in terms of disgust. So disgusting pictures draw visual attention. They create different kinds of attentional effects, like attentional blink, which suggests that it's basically the idea is that if you are paying so much attention to this one thing, you don't see other things that are going on in your environment, or you don't process them very well. So they're locking in on these visual cues. There's a good amount of evidence suggesting that a lot of those physical changes, what we can call physically abnormal features, are connected either attentionally or through encoding processes to what people are paying attention to or what they're perceiving when they're concerned about disease, also when they have suppressed immune functioning. So suppressed physiological immune functioning might be a time when it would be especially important to pay attention to these threats in your environment. We certainly know that a lot of the objects that are carriers of disease or disease may actually cause disease create very strong negative reactions in people. And those could be fear-based reactions, they could be disgust-based reactions. There is some evidence, some debated evidence I think needs more replication, that even just seeing images of sick people, that is vectors of disease transmission, can create physiological changes in the body that suggest there is a direct detection of this pathogenic threat. So you see images of a sick person and aspects of your components of your immune system become more active, right? With the idea that it's ramping up in preparation for the potential of infection. We have seen some evidence that people can just directly tell. If I showed you images of people who are truly infected with something versus who are not, people are at better than chance levels able to detect or identify who is sick and who is not. Now, this isn't a big effect. It's usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 65% accuracy, but that's still better than chance. So people are using visual information, this is just from a picture, to understand the infection process that's going on. And finally, people see sickness as associated with more abnormal characteristics. So as part of this review of the literature, what I'm going to do is, in different parts, I'll tell you about some of the work that we've been doing in the lab. A lot of these data are unpublished. Some of them are published, but a lot of them are not. And to give you a sense of the kinds of things that we've been working on. So in order to understand this point about seeing or associating abnormality with disease, we've been doing some work where we use what's called a reverse correlation paradigm to understand what's going on inside someone's head without them having to tell us. And the reverse correlation paradigm is really useful. It's a bottom-up way of building a representation of an infected person or a target person. So what we do here to get to do this is we use what's called a base face. And this face here is an average of a lot of faces coming from different kinds of databases. So this is an average person. They don't actually exist, but they're an average of a bunch of people. And we overlay a random noise image on top of this, giving you something like this. Now, this procedure, and this is not the whole procedure, but this is how you started out. This procedure is used, again, as I mentioned, to understand the people's mental representation of some kind of issue. This could be a certain kind of a person, a certain kind of a group. Here we're interested in a certain kind of a threat, and that is infection in other people. So what happens is something like this. We do this process hundreds of times. So we create hundreds of different kinds of images and then have participants choose. We just show them random pairings of faces. There is nothing in these images that has anything to do with germs, infection, anything like that. There is simply random noise that's overlaid over a face. And all people do is make choices between pairs. And if you do this enough times, you can get essentially a set of images that people think are more germy or represent germs more, and then you average all these together into a single face. And that resulting composite is essentially a result of what people's internal mental representation is that doesn't require people to tell you anything. It doesn't require them to put detail on what they think a person's face looks like who's infected. And so here are some of the data that we've, or some of the results that we have so far. We've done this a few times, but here's one example. Here, what you have are two composite images that after people have done this like 400 times. Here is the germy composite, and here's the non-germy composite. These are obviously very fuzzy, but it's not hard to see that there are big differences between these faces, right? This is a relatively neutral face. This guy is certainly not looking that I would say neutral. In fact, you might see a whole lot of different things about differences between the germy composite and the non-germy composite. And what you do once you've created these composites is you give them to separate people, separate groups of participants to judge based on different kinds of characteristics. So you have them rate the characteristics of what they see now in these composites. We've also done this not just in terms of having people choose, but measuring people's chronic concern about germs. That is, their chronic worries that they're going to be exposed to germs. And you might not see big differences here. So this is the same kind of germy composite generated by somebody who's not that worried about germs, and this is somebody who is worried about germs. You see much more subtle distinctions because they're both germy composites, but there is more extreme kinds of ratings that are given to the people who are just chronically worried about germs. And here are some of the kinds of ratings that you see. And I want to particularly point out this issue of this figure. This is one of the ones we've been really interested in. And you see a number of different kinds of physical characteristics that get rated more highly. So higher numbers here mean that the germy composite is rated more highly than the non-germy composite. Yeah.
Really quickly, the non-germy composite is not just the unselected image. It's actually selected to be.
It depends on the study. So at some points it is the what's called the anti-classification image, so the ones that's not chosen. And sometimes we actually have people choose some other kind of image. Yeah. So we've done this with people choosing germy or not. We've done this with people choosing germy versus violent. So we're trying to distinguish different kinds of threats, infected versus healthy, these kinds of things. And relatively consistent patterns of results here where people are essentially seeing more of these different kinds of physical features in the germy people than in the non-germy people. There's a reason we've looked at these in particular. These are the ones in the literature that people have experimentally manipulated and shown that people who are worried about disease become avoidant of or become concerned about. But here, we're taking a very bottom-up approach to see whether those features are actually components of the representation that people hold inside their heads. Okay. So the point here, though, is simply that the mental image that you have of an infected person or a germy person includes a number of very specific visual dimensions or visual features. Okay, let's go to downstream effects. So things where if you are cued or you're worried about disease, this causes changes in various types of other kinds of thinking, other kinds of behavior, and so on. Well, we see a lot more downstream effects in non-human animals as compared to direct effects. So for instance, killifish have been shown to avoid shoaling with other fish that have black spots, and black spots are representative of infection in those fish. So there is an avoidance response that these fish are showing in response to cues, visual cues. A variety of different things like antelopes and so on will avoid feeding environments where there are visual cues to things like feces in the environment. This, as far as I can tell, this literature is somewhat debated in terms of whether it's really the visual information or whether it's something about scent as well. So there seems to be some inconsistent evidence. So for instance, primate work suggests that it's not always the case that, for instance, chimpanzees are going to respond negatively to visual cues of things like feces. Right? They do respond to some cues, but not always visual cues. Interestingly, there's some what seem like counterintuitive findings as well. So male birds have been shown to feed more closely to visibly infected other birds of their same species. This is an interesting result, but one that actually makes some sense. Any guesses as to why this might happen? Why would male birds want to get closer to or feed near infected other birds? I'll give you a hint. It matters that they're male. Yeah.
Because they're not healthy enough to fight them off or to compete.
So it's about competition, yeah. So infected male birds are just more lethargic. They don't compete as much, and so you have more opportunity to go feed near them without worrying about aggression, essentially. So they're trading off this aggression for the potential for infection. And we do know that animals will track various types, what we might think about as parasite resistance, by being sensitive to sexually selected characteristics. Again, these are very indirect indicators of whether or not an animal might be infected or not. Same thing in humans. We see a lot of different kinds of downstream effects. All of the research that uses experimental manipulations of disease that, in terms of visual cues creates effects like this. So spillover effects simply suggest that we are very sensitive to these visual cues. We also know that there's the behavioral immune system literature has a lot of these types of findings throughout it, that people who are concerned about disease, whether it's active concern or chronic concern, they tend to do things like stigmatize people on specific visual dimensions, including a lot of the ones that I showed you are part of that mental representation, right? So things like elderly appearance and obesity, physical disability, attractiveness, and so on. Okay. Lastly, I'll tell you about some very recent work that we've been doing connected to this idea of downstream effects. So disease concern, that is being worried that there are pathogens in your environment, not only change how you see the external environment, but they change how you see yourself. So they create essentially what is appearance anxieties. So we've done a number of studies. I'll just show you a couple of data points associated with these, where essentially, here this is body esteem, specifically appearance-based body esteem. So what's going on here, this is, oops. This is reversed. Sorry, I should reverse this. So higher numbers here mean people are more worried about their own physical appearance. And what's going on here is that when people are situationally, that is experimentally cued with some sort of disease threat in their environment, some sort of potential threat of disease, you see that the more people are chronically worried about germs, the worse they feel about their own appearance, or the more worried they become about their own appearance. And that's not true for a lot of the other threats that we've examined. There seems to be something specific to physical appearance that people are associating with pathogen infection. And it's not just other people's physical appearance, it's your own appearance, which I think makes some sense if we know that other people out there could be infected. Well, if our physical appearance is going to change, then we might suffer things like ostracization from other people if they see changes in us. Not only do people become worried, they want to do things to change their physical appearance. So they also become more interested in things like everything from increased purchase and use of makeup to liposuction to to plastic surgery and so on when they're worried about disease. So people are really concerned about this idea of their physical appearance. Okay. This doesn't seem to be the case for a variety of other kinds of threats and outcomes. Yeah.
Is that all disease or just infectious disease?
So we've only been looking at infectious disease, and that's a great question. It may be,
Specifically for infectious disease.
yeah, it may be that there are very similar mechanisms in the mind that people use to construe infectious and non-infectious disease. And there are some reasons to think that that might be the case, but we've just been concentrating on infectious. Okay. Really quickly, any questions about sight? Okay, let's move on to the second in the list that people thought would be very effective for detecting pathogens, and that's hearing. So it turns out that there is relatively little research on auditory information as a marker of infectious disease. So lots of people, in fact, I've been like polling people since I've been here just randomly, and half the time people say sound is the most useful thing, and here in these data they say it's the second most useful. But there's just very little research to suggest whether or not that's the case. In direct effects in non-human animals, I haven't found a single article suggesting one way or the other. In humans, we do know that some things people are sensitive to, right? This is really a shocking finding here, but vomiting does not sound good to people, although it's worse for older people than for younger people. We do know that when you hear things like coughs and sneezes in other people, markers of these behavioral changes of infection, they do activate disease concerns in people. Right? This is not the same as saying, I know there is an infectious disease in this person, but it does activate disease concern. It also can trigger mimicked behaviors, right? So coughing, you hear somebody cough, you're more likely to cough in response as well, which might be functional if you think about it, right? So if somebody's coughing and expelling germs in the environment, maybe you coughing, expelling things as well before it gets too far into your system would be good, although you do see it as especially prevalent in hypochondriacs. One question we had was, is it possible, though, so people do seem to have some sensitivity, obviously, to sound, right? We hear people coughing and sneezing all the time. It doesn't really always, it's not like an attractive sound, typically. Now, is it the case, though, that people are accurate in their use of this information? That is, can they really tell whether somebody is infected or not from coughing and sneezing? So, this is the question. We've done a series of studies to investigate this, to try to understand whether people do this. What I would like to do is try it in here. So what I'm going to do is play a series of coughs and sneezes for you. And I just want you to see if you can tell which of these people actually are sick. You know, I could cough for no reason other than I tried to cough. Right? I could sneeze because some dust got in my nose. But what I want to know from you is, can you tell which of these which of these sounds are stemming from people who are truly have an infection? So I'll play.
Question. I want to be totally prepared for this game. So is the alternative that they're faking this sound, or is it just that they got dust in there?
Yeah, it's not faking.
Okay.
The other kinds of things that could be in here, and I'm not remembering exactly what they are. You could have a smoker's cough. Okay. You could have allergies. You could, some of the sounds involve people doing things like plucking nose hairs and then sneezing, those kind of things. Inhaling cinnamon, those kind of things. Okay, so I'm going to play all 4 coughs and then just do a show of hands and see what you get. Okay, that was 1. Two. Okay, last one. Okay, so let's just by a show of hands, let's see whether or not you are able to detect correctly which of these people were truly infected. So how many people, just by show of hands, would say, and I will tell you, I'll even clue you in, 50% of these are truly sick and 50% are not. So how many people say sound number 1? Okay. All right, so maybe half the audience. How about sound number 2? Okay, maybe 90%. How about sound number 3? Okay, maybe 75%. How about sound number 4? Okay, maybe 40%. Here are the actual, maybe, let's see. Now you're going to get questions. Oh, why? Okay. Well, for some reason, the coughs are not coming up. What's that? Yeah, I'll play the sneezes anyway. So coughs, it was cough 1 and cough 4 were sick. I think 90% of people said 2. That was a smoker's cough, and then the third one was an allergic cough. Let's try the sneezes even though you know the answer. And so the correct answers here are 2 and 4, whereas the 1 and 3, 1 was some sort of powder being inhaled, and 3 was allergies. So whether or not you would have said 2 and 4, we've done these kinds of studies with a large number of sounds across a large number of people, and maybe here's what we tend to find. These are just a couple of example data slides. What we see here is not accuracy yet. This is people's certainty of whether or not they're going to be accurate. So this is comparable to those earlier data I showed you where people reported their perceived accuracy of using a particular sense. Here, we see very consistently that people say, at least better than chance, that they will be able to do this accurately. In fact, they just did it accurately. And it is true regardless of what we do ahead of time. So we've done some studies where we have people rate the disgusting quality of the sound first or other kinds of qualities of the sound to see if that changes what they're orienting to. But we get very consistent patterns of results. The accuracy is, if not at chance, always below chance. So people are terrible at this. Despite the fact that they consistently say they're very good. In fact, they might rate the use of sound-based information to detect disease in other people as the most effective, if not the second most effective. Right? And again, we see that regardless of the kind of manipulation we've done so far, we get very similar results. The one thing that people seem to be doing, and I think that you did this in here with the coughs, was you were tracking how disgusting you thought that sound was. Right? So this is why we see sort of no good results. The more disgusting the sound is, the more likely people are to say it's infectious. And that works if it really is infectious, but it doesn't work if it's not infectious. Right. Yeah.
I was curious if there's been any research on it's not a disgust response,
Yeah.
but just potentially a sign of illness.
No, I mean, presumably we could do some coding of the sounds that we have or get better sounds that we manipulate on these kinds of features. But as far as I'm aware, no, there is no research. There is. Great. We'd like to hear about it later. Are any of the features useful for this question? Okay. I would love to know about it. Yeah.
When people did this, they didn't know the proportion that was actually sick and not sick.
No, we actually told them what the proportion was. Yeah. Yeah. So they're clued in. They should be able to at least get close if they are able to correctly use the right kind of information. But they're not. Okay, how about downstream effects? Again, I haven't found any human-based downstream effects or animal-based downstream effects on auditory cues to illness and the kinds of cognition or the kinds of behaviors they produce in people. I'd love to see if any of that is in the literature. Okay, let's move on to touch. So turns out that touch may be a very useful way of picking up on infection. In fact, because it is the most direct route of pathogen transmission in people, at least. what do we see in terms of direct effects in non-human animals? Well, there doesn't appear to be, as far as I can tell, a lot in terms of direct sensitivity. Now, there are some things. So, for instance, again, some work here from UCLA suggests that animals are sensitive to tactile indicators of pathogen carriers. So, like parasites crawling on your body, things like that, do elicit very orienting responses to those things. So there's some work there. There is some evidence. It seems to be dependent upon the particular type of group that you're investigating, but some evidence in chimpanzees that they will clean certain kinds of body parts that are soiled with disgusting tactile elements. And I'll tell you what those are in a second. But that does not seem to be a very universal behavior. So in terms of direct sensitivity, it's unclear whether animals are doing a lot through the means of touch of picking up on the presence of disease in their environments. In humans, there's been a variety of interesting work coming out recently on things like suggesting that when you're concerned about, when you're disgusted, when you are feeling higher levels of pathogen disgust, it increases your general tactile sensitivity, so you just become more sensitive to the potential to be touched, so regardless of what it is that's touching you. But there are certain kinds of things, and these are the kinds of things that chimps like to clean off in those cases, that are considered to be disgusting, right? Things that are mushy or wet or slimy, essentially biological. Those kinds of things that might be that might increase pathogen transmission. So those tend to be more disgusting than other tactile qualities. We do see that people tend to have a pretty strong aversion generally to organic matter that spreads easily, again, coming out of the same kind of idea of disgusting tactile qualities. That being said, those kinds of reactions don't necessarily come online very strongly in humans until around ages 5 to 7, suggesting there's some developmental trajectory that's going on there in terms of people becoming sensitive to this. Although there seems to be some evidence of perhaps of a direct aversion to, if not a direct tactile sensitivity to things like toxins. So this is not necessarily infectious disease, but toxins in plants in young infants. How about downstream effects? Well, there certainly is some evidence of downstream effects related to touch. Chimps have been found to eat less food if they've just touched something that's one of those that's represented as one of those disgusting tactile dimensions I just mentioned, than if they haven't. We might cast as a downstream effect, we might try to understand alarm calling in animals as connected to this idea of avoiding touch with others. So most alarms that are given between animals don't involve physical contact, and maybe that has something to do with this aversion to spreading pathogens. And there are a number of different kinds of sanitation practices that non-human animals use, suggesting they are at least trying to, depending on how you want to define try, they're trying to get rid of potential elements associated with pathogens. So this can be everything from rotating nest sites, grooming, use of antimicrobial substances, and so on. Suggesting, again, this is all through direct contact, so physical contact with these kinds of either other creatures or other substances. In humans, we do see, again, different types of sensitivities. So we can think about scratching in response to not just feeling insects, but seeing insects. So seeing insects can trigger this sense of I have to check my body, or I have to do something in terms of touching my own body. We've seen some evidence, both in some of our work and other people's work, that if you are the kind of person who's chronically worried about germs, it has an effect on or has associated with different kinds of tactile information that you use. So for instance, chronic germ aversion, chronic worries about germs, we've seen across a number of studies is associated with higher levels or actually lower levels of pain sensitivity. So what that means, or pain tolerance, what that means is that if you are worried about germs, you feel pain quicker and it becomes more aversive more rapidly. We also see that people who are more worried about germs are more averse to interpersonal contact and to objects that other people have come into physical contact with. Here is one example of that. There's a huge literature on aversion to objects that people have touched, right? We can think about, it's cast in different language, but things like psychological contagion or magical contagion, this idea that we avoid some kinds of things because of some lay understanding of transmission through direct contact. We've done some work showing these same kinds of effects in terms of secondhand products. So if you think about consumer products, you could go to a store and buy a brand new thing, or you could go to a store and buy something used. Well, the kinds of things that people become very sensitive to, the kinds of products people become sensitive to when they're worried about germs, are secondhand or used products. So what we see is that people are less willing to pay for used products, specifically when they are worried about disease. And this is true in the lab. It's also true if you just look at purchasing patterns across the US using various types of economic data. Right? So less used merchandise is sold in places where there are higher levels of environmental pathogen prevalence. Right? What else? So we see also that touch is used as a means of managing pathogen threats. So it's not just that people, this is sort of an interesting downstream way of looking at this. Touch is used to control or to treat pathogen threats. So you can think of controlled exposure, this is an interesting behavior to me, to infected others. This basic idea is, let's say, I think the most common example of this, let's say you have a kid and your kid, you know that someone in that kid's class or elementary school or what have you, kindergarten, has the chicken pox. What do? Maybe instead of keeping your kid away, you have them go play with this kid, right? And the idea is that they are going to contract chicken pox. You're trying to infect them as a means of essentially creating invulnerability to that threat later in life. So controlled exposure, we also see different kinds of sanitation type practices in people. So when people are disgusted, this actually can help promote washing behavior over other types of methods of encouraging washing. So if you see like signs around campus about wash your hands in the bathroom or something, it's been found that if you make those signs contain disgusting content, they work better than signs that just tell people to wash their hands. So it activates the sense, oh, I feel dirty, I gotta clean. And we also see that hand washing can actually get in the way of these threat reactions. And this, I think, really nicely ties this idea of tactile contact to disease detection. That is, if you wash your hands, let's see, yeah, so I'll walk through this in a second. If you wash your hands, it makes you feel less vulnerable to germs. And this can be shown in a variety of ways. We've seen that this plays out in terms of some of the stereotype activation that occurs. So when people are concerned about disease, they express more negativity towards unfamiliar foreign groups. Washing your hands gets rid of some of that. Here, we were looking at general risk propensity, so we did different kinds of risk measures. And we had people either wash their hands or do something that was very similar in terms of motor behavior. That is, examine a piece, so you can think about this versus examining a piece of paper. You're still doing something similar, but you're not actively washing. And it turns out that under conditions of pathogen threat, people who wash their hands go up to some degree in risk propensity, whereas people who are examining the paper go down. So over a lot of studies, including these in this package, disease makes people more risk averse. But hand washing stops that risk aversion. And if anything, it can let people become more risk approaching as a sense that they are safe. This is a very irrational response, if you think about it, because washing your hands might get rid of germs on your hands, but it's not going to stop you from getting new germs. But yet people act as though they feel more invulnerable to disease threats. Okay, any questions about touch? Okay, let's go to smell. So, smell. Can people use smell to detect disease? Well, turns out you can be trained to do this. So doctors can be trained to, and sometimes are trained to detect certain kinds of diseases, whether they're infectious or not, based on the smell of the patient. And here are some of those smells that doctors have been trained on. Some of these are obviously more specific than others. You might want to be careful next time you smell fresh baked bread around somebody, I guess. Could be some typhoid fever going on. Okay, so you can do this. You can detect disease through scent. The question is, does the average person do this? Do they use scent-based information to understand whether or not there's a true disease in their environment? Well, how about in non-humans? So olfactory information is the most common type of information that many non-human animals use to detect disease. So I'm not going to go through the tremendous literature on that, but just to give you some example types of findings. So directly exposing certain animals to the scent of pathogens can, again, activate immune upregulation. So really kicking into gear this kind of preparatory response of the immune system with the idea being they'll be infected soon. This happens even in plants. So plants can activate certain kinds of defenses if chemosensory information around disease is detected by them. In humans, we see some work suggesting that, again, focusing on disgust reactions to contamination appear to create protection or promote expulsion types of behaviors, which makes a lot of sense. You don't want to take in things that are potentially pathogenic. We find the body odor of infected other people, especially if they're strangers to us, to be more aversive. In terms of downstream effects, there is some evidence. So I mentioned earlier that primates don't use visual information very much at all. There's some information suggesting that they use odor-based information. It seems to be somewhat weak, though, associated with food. But there is a lot of examples of avoidance. When animals smell infected others, they avoid them. And this is across a huge number of different kinds of species. Interestingly, these kinds of avoidance behaviors are often sexually dimorphic. So female mice seem to be less attracted to the scent of infected males. You don't necessarily see the same pattern of behavior, or at least the strength of that behavior, for males smelling females. Although, again, some interesting data suggesting how pathogens control their hosts. So are people familiar with this particular pathogen, Toxoplasma gondii? Yeah, so it has in certain kinds of hosts, has a strong means of controlling behavior of those hosts. And so here, males infected with this become more attractive to female rats. So they're doing things, they're releasing certain kinds of chemical signals that make them more attractive in order to promote transmission. In humans, again, there's not a ton of work suggesting downstream effects of scent in humans, but presumably we would assume that body odor, if we can detect body odor infected others, we would avoid those people. There is some work suggesting that other types of health behavior can be triggered when we smell pathogen indicating, or at least pathogen associated scents. So offensive smells increase tendency to use condoms. And there's some interesting data suggesting that perhaps people choose, or at least become more comfortable and happy with romantic partners based on scent-based information that cues things like, well, how compatible is their immune system functioning to my own? That's basically all I wanted to talk about with regards to smell. Any questions there? All right, let's go to the last one, taste. So again, taste is not always doesn't make the most sense when we're talking about interpersonal transmission, but we don't necessarily have to talk about interpersonal transmission. So certainly it's the case that putting things into our mouths is making us vulnerable, right? Where our first line of physiological defense against infection is our skin, and so we're letting things in to bypass these. And so we might want to be pretty sensitive to taste-based cues of infection, and even Darwin was sensitive to this. So in non-human animals, we see a variety of different kinds of direct effects in terms of taste sensitivities. So they're not always directly associated with pathogen transmission, but sometimes it's toxin transmission. So bitterness is the big one associated with these toxins at high concentrations. And so you'll see a lot of things like mouth gaping in animals, and what could be considered negative affect, you get the same thing in people too, right? So bitterness, again, evokes this mouth gaping, the idea that you want to expel that bad taste. It also gets you different kinds of effects in people, like sensory specific satiety. So if you constantly are eating bitter things, it makes you more satiated to that specific food. So you want to move on to a different type of food, perhaps as a means of not building up various toxins that could be in those foods. And you see direct triggering, again, of various immune reactions. So tasting bitter tastes activates increased mucosal buildup and cilia that are designed to clear that. So with the idea being that you have an immediate defense reaction and you're trying to expel things based on that taste. And this is true for a variety of other kinds of disgust responses. Again, we were talking earlier, I'm not sure if how these data hold up or if they do hold up, but you see some data suggesting that disgust, especially food-based disgust, tends to be especially high in the first trimester of pregnancy, and to some degree is maintained across pregnancy, with the idea being that you're avoiding taking in harmful agents that could affect the developing fetus. However, no research that I could find has investigated this question of whether we can taste sickness in other people. So, for the grad students out there, that's something you can look at. How about downstream effects? Food neophobia is a big one. So food neophobia, basically avoidance of new foods. You really focus on things you've eaten before because those are associated with safety, right? Especially in species that have a varied diet. In humans, we see the same sort of thing. It tends to be linked to trait disgust. So the more you're easily disgusted, the more you avoid new things. The more you avoid things like foods from other cultures. Right? And that's especially true when pathogen concerns have been made situationally salient. So for instance, here are some data that from studies that we've done. This was a taste test that we had people do. People were given the option to taste one of two foods. One was something very familiar to them, and one was from a foreign cuisine. And what you see here is that when people were concerned about pathogens, they strongly drop in terms of their interest in tasting and actually eating foreign foods, even if they might have some degree of interest in those under everyday conditions. And this is true not only just in samples in the US, so it's also specific to pathogen threat. We've done this in different cultures as well, where we have people choose different kinds of foods that they would want to eat under conditions of pathogen threat or not. And we've done this, for instance, in cultures, both in the US and in cultures that are wildly different in terms of the environmental threat of pathogens, right? So in India, there's a much higher chance you're going to become infected by various pathogens. And what you see is that the same sort of pattern where there's this drop in interest in foreign foods under pathogen threat. You get something similar, somewhat weaker, but something similar among Indian participants, where now the foreign food is American food, right? So you still see this drop in interest. Interestingly, we do, across just about all the studies we've run, found that people who are actively concerned about disease and pathogens become more interested in domestic food. They're not trying to avoid food. They're not trying to say, I'm just not hungry anymore. What they do is they become more interested in seeking out these sources of familiarity and sources of safety. In terms of other kinds of downstream effects, so just adding familiar flavors to unfamiliar foods can make people more willing to try them, even though it's not changing the content, that even, for instance, the pathogenic content of that food. It's just that taste sensitivity that people are paying attention to. And there's a variety of learning mechanisms, again, suggest that people are quite sensitive to the taste-specific elements of that food, and they use it for things like avoidance of foods later on. And there's all sorts of interesting things that are coming out these days in terms of extending beyond just food-based consumption. So tasting bitter things can make people express more moral disgust and more interpersonal aversion of other people, suggesting there's some spillover. Of course, there are a lot of things we do to manipulate taste-based qualities, perhaps to cut down on the pathogen burden that's associated with specific cuisines. So if you're familiar with, probably a lot of people in here are familiar with this idea of using different kinds of spices to control pathogenic elements in food. Here's some data suggesting some of the more powerful ones. So like garlic, onion, oregano can be at least quite powerful at cutting down or eliminating microbes in foods. And so we see this happen quite a bit, especially in places where there's this high environmental pathogen prevalence. Okay. So those are some of the findings that exist out there in the world of sensory detection of disease. Now I wanted to sum up and basically leave you with some questions that I think that this kind of information generates, perhaps for future research. So we see that there is some evidence anyway, that evidence exists in humans anyway, in every sensory modality. There doesn't appear, as far as I'm aware of, to be any work that's directly contrasting senses against each other. So although we can get data on what people think are going to be the most effective, we haven't, nobody has actually given people like visual versus scent-based information to see if one is actually more effective. It also doesn't appear that these lay beliefs are entirely accurate in terms of this ordering of effects. And I think there are some interesting questions as to why that might be, right? And here's just a couple of possibilities. It might just be that people are associating sight and sound with disease more so because they hear coughing and sneezing and they see we're visually dominated species, right? And so they might assume that they're able to detect disease using these senses more than these senses. We also might think from a functional point of view that these, at least the first couple here, don't require people to come into contact with potential germ carriers. Right? You can hear somebody from a distance. You can see somebody from a distance. It's much harder, or if not impossible, to touch somebody from a distance and smell and taste and so on. So people might be defaulting to overgeneralizing the effectiveness of certain kinds of sensations because they provide this sense of safety. Okay, so a few questions that I think that this raises. One has to do with function. We can think about function from the point of view of just what is going on, right? So if we're able to, for instance, knock out certain kinds of sensory processing through, like, for instance, finding people with certain sensory disorders, do they become infected more readily, right? This would give us some direct evidence that this sensory information is functional. We can also think about function from a more, a more textured viewpoint. That is, how function might work. So pathogen defense strategies have been characterized along 3 different dimensions. These can be avoidance-based strategies, resistance strategies, and tolerance strategies. So avoidance is where you don't get infected in the first place. Resistance is where you get rid of the germs that you have either on or in you. And tolerance is where you let those germs be, but you minimize their effects. And I think what this review suggests is that there is a reasonably good evidence that people are trying to use this sensory information to avoid. There is some evidence they use it to reduce pathogen burden, right? So if you think about like the tactile information of feeling things crawling on you and trying to get those things off, this would be suggestive of resistance-based strategies. Tolerance is much less clear. This idea that we just let germs in, but we try to minimize their effects. And actually, tolerance is a very understudied topic, at least in the world of pathogen threat psychology, right? There's really next to nothing that has really strongly considered this idea of allowing germs to exist. But there are some possibilities. So it's possible that if you are more tolerant to pathogens, you might not be as sensitive to various kinds of sensations that trigger or signal pathogens. So you might allow pathogens to be there as long as you have the bodily means of reducing their effects. And one kind of behavior that people have associated with this idea of tolerance is sickness behavior, right? So you just sort of shut down, but you conserve bodily resources to essentially fight off the effects of things rather than get rid of the pathogens themselves. Another concept connected to tolerance is preconditioning. And preconditioning is something that it's known in the physiological world. It's not been looked at as far as I'm aware in the psychological world, and this is the idea that if you are exposed to a very minor amount of a stressor, then this can allow increased tolerance of that stressor in more severe amounts later on. So basically the idea is that that initial stress triggers defenses in your body that are designed not to get rid of the source of that stress, but to manage that stress in terms of your physiological functioning. And one question is whether this kind of sensory information can trigger those same kinds of responses in people. I mentioned a few things earlier about people seeing disease and immune system activation. There's been some interesting work suggesting that if you see signs of sickness, your immune system kicks into gear, and that might be a type of preconditioning strategy. So we've seen at least a couple of data points suggesting that. Lastly, there are a lot of other questions that I'm sure that you've been thinking about, but we can think about other kinds of sensory modalities. When people are walking through the world, they're not choosing a sense to use. They're integrating across these senses. Again, not something that's really been looked at that much. We've started doing some work on what's called interoception, and this is the idea of people not just using external sensory information, but trying to understand internal changes in their body. So looking inward to understand, like, is your heart rate increasing? Is your temperature increasing? And try to sort of pay inward attention to these changes as a result of pathogen threats. We've also started to do some work on physiological functioning to try to understand whether if you have more active or less active current immune system functioning, how does this translate into sensory processing? We can think about developmental effects. And finally, ecological effects. I think there's some really interesting questions to be asked here in terms of things like, if you live in a place where pathogen threat is really high, what do you do? Are you more reactive in terms of various senses, or are you less reactive? And I think we can make functional arguments on both sides of the coin there. Similarly, we can think about how introduction of sanitation practices to certain groups of people, again, may in some ways seem like this should cut down on the use of sensory information, but in other ways, we can think of it allowing increased control over pathogen exposure, so you're going to use more sensory information when you do have that sense of control. All right, if you're interested in some of these questions, and I would love it if you have others that you want to let me know about. Some of these ideas are talked about in a recent paper that we have focusing on some of these issues. But for now, I'll wrap it up and say thank you again for letting me come and talk about this kind of very diverse type of review and project. And I'm really, really hoping to hear some feedback from you about what you know around these topics. Anyway, thanks to everybody who's been involved with it, and thanks to you.
Thank you, fascinating stuff. It could be that in ancestral environments, people who were most likely to acquire infections, were most likely to infect you, they were people who knew. So that raises the possibility that the mechanisms for detecting infectious disease in others are worked by comparing the person's, how they look, sound, smell, what have you, to a baseline. And so when you use stimuli from strangers, such as we all did so badly on telling which the coughs were. Well, if you know someone and you know that they have an allergy or a smoker's cough, you know what that cough sounds like, and then you could compare the cough when they have an infectious disease to that. I know this would be difficult to study, but it seems like conceptually a fruitful area.
So tell me if I'm walking down the right path with you here. So I think what you're suggesting is essentially something akin to just establishing, essentially controlling for baseline variance, right, in the person. So if you know what that person starts out as, then you have a better ability to pull out any detection that people are going. So I think that makes sense. I'm not sure yeah, I think that would be an interesting way to go. It'd be difficult, obviously, like as you mentioned, to track people over those periods of time. But I guess what we really want to pay attention to is not just that something has changed, but that the specific quality of what has changed is important to detecting those diseases. Yeah.
just sort of building on the idea that in the ancestral environment you would have been interacting primarily with kin, something like that. Is there any evidence that within a disease family the pattern of symptom expression is biased towards maybe more visible cues in infancy to recruit assistance from adults or something like that?
So the idea is that if you're able to have control over the symptoms you express due to infection, then you might want to increase the level of those symptoms that are being expressed in order to recruit help from other people.
Something like
right?
that, yeah.
So there is evidence at a psychological level, so that people will say things are worse for them than they really are, right? If they have care available, oh, this is a really, really bad cold, versus if there's no one around, and it's like, well, it's bad, but it's manageable. So things like self-reporting and psychological reactions, there is evidence for. I'm not aware of physical evidence that would suggest that people have that level of control over symptom expression. There might be some interesting individual types of studies, case studies, where you could think about that happening. There's also just to twist your question a little bit, there's also the flip side of this, and that is not just what's going on with the individual host's control over this, but what's going on with the pathogen's control over their host, right? So is it the case, let's say you're a pathogen, this is a very speculative question, let's say you're a pathogen that is transmitted from person to person, right, in social situations. So it's much easier for you to be transmitted when you're in contact with other people. Right? If there is selection on that pathogen to, let's say there is immediate avoidance or aversion to people who show physical symptoms of infection, right? What a pathogen might want to do, or might be under selection to do, is minimize the signs of that infection until transmission has happened, right? So you might expect that there's selection for socially transmitted diseases to show fewer types of physical symptoms, so that people can still interact with others before becoming visibly infected and thus avoid it. I'm not aware of any data, and I've floated this idea with a few people. I'm not aware of any data to discuss that.
Chris Schreiber has done work showing that it increases sociality.
Great.
So a couple of follow-ups to some of these discussions. First, thank you for really stimulating work. In regard to Joe's point, it has become orthodoxy in the behavioral immune system community, and you referenced this a couple of times, that outgroup avoidance is proper domain and a functional feature of disease avoidance psychology in humans. And there are very good reasons having to do with the structure of ancestral human populations, the nature of disease evolution, and the nature of trade relationships between ancestral groups, to think that that is completely wrong, and that instead this is an example of cultural evolution exploiting evolved psychology to promote in-group favoritism.
Okay.
Right? So I think we should put a big caveat around any results having to do with outgroup avoidance as indicating functional features of the mechanism itself. In terms of, Andrew, your question, so Leo Tiokin, who was Avery's predecessor as the Beck staffer, has a paper in Quarterly Review of Biology on symptom expression as a function of assistance solicitation across species, right? And the general argument is that there is strategic manipulation of symptom expression to limit disclosure of liability to predators or hostile conspecifics and to solicit. So I think that there's good evidence in support of that position. In terms of the manipulation of the host by the pathogen, there's always a trade-off between, and there's a direct analogy here in terms of the evolution of virulence, and maybe it's not even an analogy, maybe it's the same thing, which is that there's a trade-off between enhancing host mobility and sociability and increasing probability of transmission through pathogen load, right? So you can keep your host up and moving around and thereby interacting with other hosts. But if that comes at the cost of the rapidity of the pathogen reproduction in the host and the load that is shed by the host, then you lose out to more aggressive strains, right? So it all depends, in other words. I don't think that we can a priori say, oh, pathogens do better by keeping their hosts up and around. It all depends on, if there's poor sanitation, then as we saw recently in Haiti, right, you get a benign strain of cholera very rapidly evolving into a very virulent strain because you don't need to keep your host up and around. And the virulent strain beats out the benign strain in the competition. If there's malaria, right, the vector does the job for you. You actually do better by immobilizing the host, right? So a lot depends on the details there. I don't think we can make any blanket predictions.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that this is another place, in addition to these trade-offs that are being made by the pathogen. I think there's another question of bringing in this notion of tolerance here too, right? So you can increase the pathogen burden for some types of pathogens, depending upon the type of interaction they have with their host. You can increase pathogen burden without increasing the detrimental effects on the host. And for some types of organisms or some types of host-organism interactions, that could be an effective way of increasing the possibility of transmission without creating that downside for sociality. The earlier point about the outgroup aversion, I think is a really interesting one, and I think you can come at this from a couple of angles. One is sort of this conceptual or theoretical angle, right? So what do we expect people to have, kind of interactions we expect people to have had in the past, versus what did the data tell us? And we certainly see that there is this orientation towards in-group favoritism and in-group attraction when disease concern is prevalent. At the same time, one way of casting this outgroup aversion is not specific to outgroups themselves or interpersonal outgroups, but to just the general avoidance of unfamiliarity, right? So there's across all sorts of different domains. We see that people who are concerned about disease really become sensitive to, increase the level at which they think about things as being unfamiliar and become averse to those unfamiliar things. And so if outgroups are just one example of that type of unfamiliar group, person, what have you, you could see something that looks like outgroup avoidance. Even though I think that the general idea of avoiding the unfamiliar could still have a functional root to it.
Thanks. So I guess I wanted to ask sort of two related things. One is about type 1, type 2 errors, right? That I felt like when you were doing the coughing and the sneezing, that I feel like I was completely horrible at determining which of those was sort of true sickness, but I'm pretty sure I was 100% at detecting the possibility of sickness. Right?
Okay.
If there's a cough, it's possible that you're there, right? So I feel like the kind of false positives and false negatives have very different probabilities.
Sure.
And so I was wondering kind of how that might play out differently across the different senses, and just coming back to what Joe was saying about having a baseline for individuals. I was wondering whether there was any traction or whether you've done any work in thinking about, rather than initial detection, at kind of, you have your activation of there's possibly a threat, and then you're really trying to determine whether that threat is genuine. So I was thinking about kind of when you mentioned smoker's cough, right? This is something that is much less prevalent now than it was, or might be much less prevalent in certain parts of the world than it is in others. So is there any kind of natural experiment that could be done by looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. We could look at actual base rates of different kinds of origins of these sounds or these different kinds of sensations. We've done measurement of people's perception of those base rates, and they track how people are answering in these paradigms. But we haven't measured actual base rates of some of these things. And so it could be that there's just very rare events that people are just associating with illness, because why not, right? The cost is very minimal to do so. Do you have another idea of how to go about doing that? So looking at I guess, frequency of the type of origin of some of these cues? Yeah, so you're saying that the rarity of something like a smoker's cough might mean that people are just not very sensitive to it, or they're just assuming that it's going to be an infectious cough. Is that how you were framing
I
it?
was actually thinking that the other way around. So
Okay.
if you had places where a high proportion of the population smoked and more people had the smoker's cough,
Yeah.
you might actually become less sensitive to coughing as a potential vector. So like
Right.
think about vertebrate monkeys where like they become, infant alarm calls get to be ignored because they're not as informative. Even though sometimes they might be informative. So I'm just, thinking about
Yeah.
signal noise.
I think that's interesting. I think we could maybe try to think about setting up an experiment that would manipulate those things, but really you'd want a natural type of experiment, right? Where there's differences in these base rates. My guess, if I had to guess, is that I'm not sure that there would be that much change in people's identification of infectious versus non-infectious origin. What I think that there might be is a change in the underlying quality that people are associating with infection. So if everybody is a smoker and is coughing all the time, you might no longer use that level of disgust as an indicator of how disgusting it sounds, as an indicator of whether you're identifying it as infectious or not.
Did you
but-
discuss become attenuated in those circumstances?
Yeah, so presumably if you're always on, if everybody around you is coughing all the time and it's disgusting sounding and you're constantly on in terms of threat perception, then that has a lot of cost associated with it as well. So you might be less sensitive in terms of the disgust quality.
I'm afraid we're actually over time, so we need to wrap now.
All right. Thank you.
Very much.